In his victory speech the night of his election, Zoran Mamdani invoked two great figures of history, Eugene V. Debs and Jawaharlal Nehru. The first, Eugene Debs, is perhaps the most famous socialist in American history. The second, Nehru, was the leader of the most populous, post-colonial, independent nation in the world, India. Together, Debs and Nehru symbolize the dawn of a new political era of cross-cultural solidarity. Mamdani summons these two world historical figures to ring in a new epoch in American politics. Mamdani's speech, drafted by Julian Gerson with Mamdani's major input, uses the metaphor of hands to introduce this new political era. First and foremost, he depicts working hands, toiling hands, scarred and blistered by repetitive use. Quote, fingers bruised by lifting boxes on the warehouse floor, palms calloused from delivery bike handlebars, knuckles scarred with kitchen burns. Second, and relatedly, he suggests that these working hands have never been allowed to hold power, to get their hands on power. But third, and most importantly, he declares that these working hands now, finally, have grasped power. The future, Mamdani proclaims, is in our hands. The metaphor of hands fits perfectly Mamdani's underlying theory of social struggle. He grounds his politics in a societal struggle between those who work, most often with their hands, and those who merely profit or take advantage of the hard work of others, between those who work in the city but can't even afford to live there, and those who live in the city without even needing to work there. But Mamdani doesn't leave matters there. He augments and enriches the class division by invoking the post-colonial struggle, epitomized by Nehru, and blends in the categories of race, ethnicity, gender, national origin, and religious background. Those who have been excluded are not just the working class. They are Muslims, Black New Yorkers, persons of color, working women as well. Mamdani refers to the, quote, Yemeni bodega owners and Mexican abuelas, Senegalese taxi drivers and Uzbek nurses, Trinidadian line cooks and Ethiopian aunties, in his words. Together, the working class, post-colonial, and global dimensions offer a novel theory of social struggle that reaches across, but also beyond the five boroughs. This was, of course, a municipal election, but Mamdani's success has national, even international implications. It represented a victory over President Donald Trump, also over the leadership of the Democratic Party, and also over the Democratic Party establishment. The establishment was really represented by former Governor Andrew Cuomo. President Trump weighed in heavily during the campaign, threatening New Yorkers with retribution if they elected Mamdani. The leaders of the Democratic Party in the House and Senate only reluctantly and belatedly endorsed Mamdani, even after he won the Democratic nomination. The power brokers and financiers of the Democratic establishment spent millions of dollars supporting Cuomo, who wasn't even running as a Democrat. So Mamdani's victory is a rebuff to President Trump, the equivalent of a midterm reversal in New York, but also to the Democratic Party establishment. And there are implications at the international level as well, especially for positioning a new left in countries around the world that are experiencing a political slide to the far right. Mamdani is a sophisticated theorist, as evidenced by his victory speech, but also by his time on the campaign. He studied critical theory at Bowdoin College in Maine, an excellent liberal arts college. He read Frantz Fanon, he learned about the Haitian Revolution, he delved into problems of urban crises and the broken windows theory. He majored in Africana studies, and he also grew up in a home of brilliant intellectuals. As a result, the critical theoretic dimensions play an important role in his vision of the world. He's not only a savvy young politician and an eloquent speaker and an astute strategist, he's also an engaged and cutting-edge political philosopher. In this regard, I'd like to suggest, he instantiates what might be called a new philosophical practice. Now, I've argued elsewhere that Zoran Mamdani is a model of a politician who offers a positive and clear vision of where he wants to lead society and provides well-defined policy proposals to support his political vision. During his campaign, Mamdani kept his eyes on the prize. He charted a clear and positive vision to make New York City more affordable for everyone who lives there. He didn't engage in negative campaigning. He didn't trade in negative messaging. Instead, he constantly offered a constructive vision and program. And it was never just no kings. It was a positive vision and precise public policies that everyone knew. Rent stabilization, free buses, universal childcare, city-owned grocery stores, community response teams, and more. Now, what I'd like to suggest, though, is that Mamdani is also the model of a political actor and thinker who is engaged in a new practice of philosophy and thinking. He's a critical theorist, political actor who's constantly confronting concrete political projects with philosophical principles and vice versa. Now, in my last essay, I argued that there is an urgent need today to develop new philosophical foundations for the left, and I proposed a different paradigm than the usual categories of capitalism versus socialism. I proposed a bottom-up model of cooperation and solidarity that builds on worker and consumer cooperatives, mutuals and mutual aid, and other forms of solidarity economy. It's a model in which the people retain the power rather than concentrating it in the hands of the state. Now, in this essay, I'd like to add that the left also needs a new philosophical practice. It's not just a question of the philosophy itself, which must always be in motion, constantly revised and revisable. It's thought in action, thought in movement, which is perhaps the greatest debt we owe to a thinker like Hegel and his dialectics. But it's not just that. It's also a question of taking a new philosophical approach, one that is politically engaged and accompanies action. And that's the key, to engage in theoretical work that takes political sides, draws sharp demarcations, and operates hand in hand with political actors to enrich politics. The left needs theorist political actors on the model of Zoran Mamdani. Now, to sketch out what I have in mind, I'll draw on the writings of the post-war French philosopher Louis Althusser, who, throughout his life, a deeply problematic and troubled life, he constantly struggled to provide the left with a philosophical foundation, and in the process developed one model of what he called a new philosophical practice. Now, of course, returning to Althusser is problematic for many reasons, most importantly because he murdered his wife, Hélène Legaucien-Reitman, in November of 1980, 10 years before his death. And of course that act has to affect how we understand him and his philosophy, and it does, as I will show. It raises difficult questions about Althusser and about his philosophical practice, and those are difficult questions, but we shouldn't shy away from them, I would argue. All right, so let's look at Althusser's relationship to philosophy and to philosophical practice. From the mid-1940s to the late 1960s and into the 1970s, Louis Althusser dedicated his intellectual life, his life quest, to one question, really: how to provide a philosophical foundation to the left. Althusser was haunted by his concern that the left, by which he meant primarily Marxism, lacked a philosophical basis. And so he made it his task to seek out theoretical foundations to enrich and empower the left. This task motivated his entire intellectual journey, and the answers that he provided over the course of his life varied greatly. They ranged from one extreme to another. Althusser started by searching for Christian foundations and then turned to Hegel's philosophy and dialectics, but eventually discarded Hegel and Christianity completely to develop a secular revolutionary foundation that he found in Marx, but also in Lenin's philosophical practice. And I'm most interested here in his writings from 1968-69 concerning what he called a new philosophical practice. So I'll dive right into that moment, 1968, 1969, and then come back later to his other proposals, the false starts and the missed opportunities, as well as his deeply problematic biography. But let's jump in to what matters most. The reason that Althusser ultimately looks forward to Lenin and other revolutionary thinkers rather than backwards to philosophers like Hegel or Kant or Fichte, or even further back to the Christian fathers, is that he came to the view that Marx had inaugurated a new scientific domain. He called this domain the science of history, and he maintained that it would give rise to a new way of doing philosophy. That new way had not yet been invented or discovered by the time of Marx's death, but it was on the horizon, and it was already announced by Marx in his famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach, the idea that there should be a new philosophy that would not just interpret the world, but change it. Althusser argued that the discovery of new scientific domains had always come first, and had only later been accompanied by new philosophical approaches. He maintained that there had only been 3 such scientific domains opened in human history, and that they each had or would be followed by a new philosophical approach. According to Althusser, the ancient Greeks launched the first scientific continent, in his words, with the discovery of the science of mathematics. That scientific domain would give rise to Plato's philosophy. Galileo discovered the second scientific domain, the science of physics, and that eventually gave birth to the philosophies of Descartes, of Kant, Kant in response to Newtonian physics, and eventually to Edmund Husserl. Althusser argued that Marx inaugurated the third of only 3 scientific domains, the science of history. Before it, there were only philosophies of history, not a science. But that he had not developed the accompanying philosophy other than to signal that it entailed an epistemological break articulated in the 11th of the theses on Feuerbach. That, according to Althusser, was the very meaning of the 11th thesis, namely that a new philosophical approach was necessary, and that it was necessarily entailed by the new science of history. But Marx did not have time to develop this new philosophical approach or to write the book on the dialectic that he had promised he would write. Instead, Marx dedicated himself to the enterprise that led to the publication of the first volume of Capital in 1867. Of course, this interpretation of scientific invention and philosophical followings is in keeping with Althusser's most well-known thesis from the mid-1960s that there's an epistemological break in the writings of Marx between the earlier philosophical and Hegelian writings pre-1985 and the later mature economic and scientific writings that led to the Capital. Althusser had famously argued that Marx's work became scientific after 1845, and that the earlier philosophical writings should be discarded as still purely ideological. That scientific work would lead, according to Althusser, to one of the three scientific discoveries in human history, the science of history. Okay, now what are the implications for philosophical practice? Althusser believed that each scientific domain would give birth to a new philosophical practice. In the case of mathematics, it was Platonic philosophy. In the case of Galilean physics, it was the philosophy of Descartes and later Kant and Husserl. But the scientific domain of history had not given rise to a new philosophical approach by the time that Marx died. And philosophy always comes late on the scene, as Althusser intimates, with a silent nod to Hegel's famous aphorism about the owl of Minerva rising at dusk, meaning, of course, that wisdom is always achieved late in the game. Althusser and others, Lenin especially, searched for philosophical foundations to Marxism in Marx's magnum opus, Capital, Volume 1. And that motivated Althusser's work on reading Capital, a collective work with his students, Etienne Balibar, Roger Establet, Pierre Macheret, Jacques Rancière, published in 1965. But, at least this is my sense, Althusser came out of that feeling that he hadn't found what he was looking for. And so he continued searching after 1965. But he continued to search not by going back in history to the pre-scientific era, but instead by going forward in history towards those who were part of the scientific paradigm, to borrow a Kuhnian term. It's for this reason that Althusser would spend so much time searching for philosophical foundations in the writings of political actors who put Marx's words into action. Not only Lenin, but also Mao, whose essay on contradiction would serve as primary material for Althusser, as well as for a while, at least in the early 1950s, until his name was no longer acceptable, tolerable, or mentionable, Stalin and his essay on dialectical materialism and historical materialism. Althusser's confrontation with Lenin, and with Lenin's relationship to philosophy, which for Lenin, as we saw earlier, included, of course, that deep dive into Hegel's logic in 1914, 1915, Althusser's confrontation with Lenin destabilized his own views in the late 1960s and led to what he would call an autocritique of his earlier position from 1950, a time at which he essentially evacuated Hegel and Hegelianism from his thinking. In a lecture that he delivered to the French Philosophical Association in February 1968, titled Lenin and Philosophy, and in another presentation he made a year later, in April 1969, called Lenin Before Hegel, Althusser brought Hegel back into his interpretation of Marx, arguing that the main debt that Marx owed Hegel was this idea of history being, in his words, a process without a subject. Now, what he meant by that was a process without a human subject, without individual humans as agents. The agents of history, Althusser maintained, are the masses, not individuals. Althusser remained convinced that there had been an epistemological break in the work of Marx, which meant that he still effectively evacuated the writings of the young Marx, and with them, the Hegelian and other philosophical influences on the young Marx. Despite that, Althusser now acknowledged that the late Marx drew on Hegel's system. He made an about-face. Marx drew on Hegel's logic and on the second part of the encyclopedia, namely on the dialectics of nature, which are non-human processes, to develop the idea of a process without a human subject. That notion of process grounded Marx's work in Capital, Althusser claimed. It also gave rise to the need for a new philosophical practice, since all prior philosophies were purely descriptive or diagnostic, but did not seek to change the world. This is what then opens the door to the search for a transformative rather than merely interpretive philosophy. It also explains why Althusser was so concerned that there was a philosophical vacuum in Marxism that needed to be filled. So filled, that is, after the science of history was born. In 1968 and 69, Althusser fills the void by returning to Lenin, to Lenin's relationship to philosophy, and to what Althusser called Lenin's new practice of philosophy. Now, before getting to that, though, let me just return for a moment to the wide-ranging nature of Althusser's other efforts to uncover a philosophical foundation for the left. And the French philosopher Jean-Baptiste Villeroy does a masterful job of elaborating these earlier moments in his book, The Birth of Anti-Hegelianism, which was published in 2022. And I just recorded a conversation with him about some of these issues that you might be interested in. So, going back to the younger Althusser then, in his first writings in 1946, Althusser tried to infuse Christian ideas into leftist thought. At the time, Althusser was still of Catholic faith and had just spent 5 years as a prisoner of war in a German stalag. Resuming his studies in philosophy at the age of 28 at the École Normale Supérieure, the ENS, Althusser argued that the Christian notion of destiny could serve as a foundation for the workers' movement. Now, at the time, Althusser was writing against the leading intellectuals of the moment, moderate leftists such as André Malraux and Albert Camus, who embraced a doomsday view of the future of mankind. A time marked by the atomic bomb, the risk of nuclear war, and the apocalyptic conditions in post-war Europe. Althusser argued that their doomsday view of destiny was a deliberate subterfuge. It allowed them to present as self-styled humanists advocating for consensual politics, but at the same time, it allowed them to reject the workers' movement. Their humanism elided the real differences that existed in the social condition of the working class. Althusser advanced instead a Christian notion of destiny as human progress and self-development, and linked that idea to the workers' movement. In effect, without saying as much, Althusser tied together the eschatological dimensions of Christianity and of Marxism. But he quickly moved away from that position and from Christian teachings. The following year, in his master's thesis, or the equivalent of his master's thesis, his DES, Diplôme d'études supérieures, Althusser turned instead to Hegel's philosophy to ground his leftist politics. Although Hegel's early notion of destiny from his 1799 essay, The Spirit of Christianity and Its Destiny, had been mentioned in 1946, Althusser gives it a far more central place in the first part of his thesis in 1947. But following that, Althusser turns primarily to Hegel's phenomenology of spirit and logic as his main sources to enrich Marx's writings. Althusser develops a hypothesis that essentially cycles between Hegel and Marx to show how they complement each other, add to each other, and lead ineluctably to a revolutionary dialectic that is embodied by the workers' movement. If at an earlier time he was drawing on the revolutionary aspects of Christianity, at this point Althusser is drawing primarily on the revolutionary aspect of the dialectic in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, which, as you will recall, ended with the French Revolution, the Terror, and the revolutionary aspect of citizenship in a supposedly rational bureaucratic empire. Only 3 years later, Althusser sheds entirely his Hegelianism in a fierce critique of his peers, published in 1950 under the title The Return to Hegel, the Last Word of Academic Revisionism. Althusser accuses French university philosophy professors of rediscovering Hegel in order to undermine the workers' movement and Marx's legacy. The Hegelianism that had come to dominate professional philosophy in the French university, Althusser maintained, was complicit with the fascist attacks on the working class. Althusser treats the renewed interest in Hegel as a reactionary political ploy. Quote, "This great return to Hegel," he writes, "is nothing more than a desperate recourse against Marx in the specific form that revisionism takes at the moment of the final crisis of imperialism, a revisionism of a fascist character." Now, in the process, Althusser, who by 1950 had evacuated Christian thought and was now renouncing Hegelianism, was left really only with Marx and his nagging sense that Marxism lacked a philosophical foundation. From that point on, Althusser searches for philosophical foundations not only in the book Capital, but in later thinkers, and political actors who would work within the paradigm that Marx opened, working within the science, normal science in a way, in a Kuhnian way. And of course, this is what leads him to Lenin. In effect, Althusser's evacuation of Hegel allowed him to search forward rather than backwards to find a philosophical praxis for Marx's science of history. It opened an entirely new, forward-looking vista. So, Lenin's new philosophical practice, what does it consist of? Well, according to Althusser, it had two main features. First, it consists in creating clear lines of demarcation within theory. As examples, one could think of, although Althusser himself doesn't mention it, his own theory of an epistemological break between the young philosophical Marx and the mature scientific Marx. Or one could think of Althusser's earlier sharp demarcation in his 1947 thesis between the early Hegel of the phenomenology of spirit, 1806, and the logic, 1812, 1817, on the one hand, and the late Hegel of the philosophy of right from 1820. And in that case, of course, he argued that the late Hegel had to be evacuated. Or one could think of, and Althusser gives this example, the way in which Lenin himself decided to read Hegel as a materialist. So those are examples of sharp demarcations. Second, it consists in taking sides in the current political struggle. More specifically, in taking sides with the workers in class struggle. It means rejecting the idea that one can or must be objective or neutral in one's philosophical judgment. Practicing philosophy, for Lenin, according to Althusser, means taking a political position. In this, Michel Foucault's and Althusser's thinking would begin to align again in the post-May 68 turmoil. Foucault had studied with Althusser and been mentored by him during his time at the ENS in the late 1940s, and they saw eye to eye on politics during the early 1950s. It was Althusser, reportedly, who encouraged Foucault to join the French Communist Party. But they had grown intellectually apart, I would say, at least until this period, around the 1970s. By the spring of 1973, in his lectures at the Collège de France on the punitive society, in his conferences in Rio on truth and juridical form, Foucault too was attacking the idea that knowledge could be divorced from politics. That great myth, namely the myth that knowledge can only achieve truth when it is cleansed of politics, that great myth, he wrote, has to be liquidated. That was in his Rio lectures. For Foucault, it was Nietzsche who began to set things straight, but it was up to us now to do the work that Nietzsche had started. This would give birth to Foucault's theory of knowledge power and eventually his genealogical method. If Foucault turned to Nietzsche in the late 1960s with his lectures on Nietzsche at the experimental campus at Vincennes in 1970, Althusser, for his part, turned to Lenin instead. The second feature, then, for both Althusser and Foucault at the time is that philosophical practice demands that the philosopher take sides. Now, I believe that this new practice of philosophy, which Althusser was trying to sketch out, could serve as a guide for us today. And it would have several important implications. First, it means that philosophical practice is conducted hand in hand with engaged political actors who are committed to transforming society, more so than with professional philosophers or university professors. Trained philosophers don't have a monopoly on philosophical practice. On the contrary, their training gives them tools and concepts to engage political actors and work in tandem with them. Insofar as political actors have taken sides and are genuinely trying to transform society, they are ipso facto engaged in philosophical practice and bring as much, if not more, to the table. Second, it means that philosophical practice does not deal in abstractions and should not operate in a bubble or in isolation. The model is not the brain in a vat or the duality of mind and body. On the contrary, philosophical practice must engage in concrete, real problems facing ordinary people. It must tend towards solutions, by which I mean political theories, visions, and horizons, as well as punctual practices, strategies, and policies. Third, it means that philosophical practice is not primarily or does not limit itself to diagnosing crises and conjunctures, nor is it about building intricate philosophical systems that describe the world. Instead, it aims to have an impact on society, to work through existing political practices to transform society. It is ambitious in that sense. It works with political movements, not merely theorizing what is going on, but using thought to help orient action, and vice versa. At the same time, fourth, trained theorists are companions, not the avant-garde. Philosophers are not intellectuals leading a revolution, but rather contribute to political transformation by confronting theory and practice. There needs to be an alliance, an integration of theorists and political actors, of thinking and doing. Political change is led by ordinary people acting in collectivity. The philosophical practice should be incorporated in social movements and politics. Fifth, and kind of returning to the basics, it means that philosophical practice takes sides. It is politically engaged and thus marked. It does not try to, nor believes that it would even be possible to be neutral, to be objective, to be an arbiter or judge. It is instead committed to the values and politics of the left, to solidarity, to cooperation, to equality, and to emancipation. It is a philosophical practice of the left. Sixth, and finally, it's a philosophical practice that reaches forward rather than backwards, and that too is fundamental for the left. It's the opposite of conservatism, which looks to the past. The practice must look forward, onwards, en avant. It is not a return to the old systems of Hegel, Kant, or Fichte, but a movement into the future. In an interesting way, Althusser's break with Hegelianism in 1950 provided the opening to explore a new philosophical practice. His fierce critique of the return to Hegel forced him to look forward, not back, with a very promising and hopeful attitude. It opened a door to forward-looking practice. For Althusser, this was the product of Marx discovering a new science of history, which would entail a new philosophical approach, with philosophy always coming later, like the owl of Minerva. Thought takes time. For us today, this approach can help orient a new philosophical practice forwards, onwards. Let me try to demonstrate how returning to Zoran Mamdani and his victory speech, and more generally his campaign, can help flesh this out. Zoran Mamdani's victory speech, which he delivered at the Paramount Theater in Brooklyn the night of November 4, 2025. The main theme, the overarching theme, of course, is this idea that we've entered a new political era. Quote, "Tonight we have stepped out from the old into the new," Mamdani exclaims. The election represents the dawn of a new era, and Mamdani enlists Eugene Debs and Jawaharlal Nehru to motivate this new era. Now, Debs symbolizes American socialism and hope, the beginning of a new era, the beginning of a new politics. Debs helped found several socialist parties in America, including the Social Democracy of America Party in 1897, the Social Democratic Party of America in 1898, the Democratic Party of America in 1901, and he ran as a socialist candidate for president 5 times, the last time from prison, where he was incarcerated for speaking out against the First World War. Debs is probably the best-known American socialist in history. And Mamdani called on him at the very beginning of the speech, quoting him saying, "I can see the dawn of a better day for humanity." Nehru symbolizes the anti-colonial struggle against imperialism and the founding of a new era, a new country, a new government characterized by social democratic politics. Nehru was a main comrade to Gandhi and became the first Prime Minister of India, serving from 1947 to 1964. And he was an author and an intellectual. And Mamdani invoked Nehru a few times in his speech, quoting him saying, "A moment comes, but rarely in history, when we step out from the old to the new, when an age ends, and when the soul of a nation, long suppressed, finds utterance." Referencing both Debs and Nehru together is philosophically significant. The first represents the more traditional socialist embrace of the working class. The second, the more contemporary appeal to decolonization and the emancipation of subjugated peoples. Mamdani is not merely introducing identity politics into class struggle, as so many before him have tried to do, so often resulting in tension or competition between race and class or gender. Instead, Mamdani is trying to bridge and reconcile the emancipatory ideals of both into a fused vision of a new era. The result is a powerful statement about a new dawn. Quote, "This new age will be one of relentless improvement," Mamdani claims. And he then, of course, substantiates the claim, stabilizing rents, providing free universal childcare, making bus transportation free, hiring more teachers, improving conditions in public housing, creating community responders, and more. In this, Mamdani self-identifies as a democratic socialist. He does not present himself merely as a social democrat, but explicitly as a democratic socialist. Quote, "I am a democratic socialist," he says, "and more damning of all, I refuse to apologize for any of this." So in this, Mamdani is proud and radical. He embraces radicality rather than convention. In fact, it's convention that has, in his views, set back the Democratic Party and resulted in the erosion of the working class base of the party. "Convention has held us back," Mamdani explains. "We have bowed at the altar of caution, and we have paid a mighty price. Too many working people cannot recognize themselves in our party, and too many among us have turned to the right for answers to why they've been left behind." So throughout his speech, there's a recurring image of a struggle between the working poor and the wealthy, On the one hand, there's the working class, the poor, those who actually do the work and who find themselves without resource, having to live 2 hours outside of New York. And on the other hand, there are the wealthy people who have all the power and are taking advantage of the workers. Quote, as has so often occurred, the billionaire class has sought to convince those making $30 an hour that their enemies are those earning $20 an hour, Mamdani says. They want the people to fight amongst themselves so that we remain distracted from the work of remaking a long broken system. We refuse to let them dictate the rules of the game anymore. They can play by the same rules as the rest of us. Mamdani's plan then is to reverse these class and colonial dynamics, to, in his words, put an end to the culture of corruption that has allowed billionaires like Trump to evade taxation and exploit tax breaks. And there's a real concreteness to his approach. It's not about abstract hope, it's about concrete expectations. He says, our greatness will be anything but abstract, right? It will be felt, he says, felt by the residents of New York who will see their rents capped, who will find childcare, who will realize greater affordability in the city. These are tangible outcomes and clear policy goals. Mamdani is setting forth a critical theory of social struggle. He's making clear demarcations. He is taking sides. Elsewhere, I've argued for a different theoretical approach that focuses less on government-run programs and more on worker and consumer cooperatives supported by the municipality. But we can set that aside for now. The theory needs to be in movement. What I see in Mamdani, though, is the exact kind of new philosophical practice that I tried to sketch out above, drawing on Althusser's insights. Now, Mamdani is not alone. There are others as well, AOC, Bernie Sanders, and we could look at their work too. But I think it's important to see how they are challenging our practice of philosophy. According to Marx's 11th thesis, the task of philosophy is not just to interpret, but to transform the world. But to transform the world, you have to have an idea of the future, of where we are headed, of where we want to go, of what the future is going to look like. And the positive vision is the transformation, is the transformative philosophical practice. Now, of course, it's important not to make too much out of a victory speech drafted in part by a speechwriter. These aren't intended to be statements of philosophy. Mamdani is not philosophizing. These are acts, political acts at a moment, an electoral moment, at a peak of success, right? But I think that Mamdani is nevertheless pushing out of the box of acceptability in his politics, with his politics. He's fighting against a system, a political system that's designed to contain him. And it's important to acknowledge that. And so to really explore these philosophical dimensions, or the question of the philosophical practice that's involved in giving such a speech and making these kind of claims. The bottom line is that Zoran Mamdani really illustrates at this moment a new practice of philosophy. This practice of philosophy is engaged, sharply demarcated, and it takes sides. And as a result, because of this particular practice, it develops a positive agenda, a positive vision for the future, and specific policies. It's a model, I would say, a model of how to do philosophical practice for a new era. Thank you.